Good morning. I'm Dr. Stacie Pettyjohn. I direct the defense program here at the Center for New American Security. And I'm delighted to have all of you who are here in person, as well as our virtual audience, join us for this fireside chat with Dr. Vipin Narang, who is the acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, a broad portfolio that includes not only the entire outer space domain, but also nuclear weapons, countering weapons of mass destruction, and important issues of deterrence, which we're going to be touching upon today. Today, we're going to focus the conversation on Europe and thinking about how NATO has evolved its nuclear posture and policy in response to recent threats made by Moscow since it has invaded Ukraine, and what it needs to do going forward to be prepared to bolster deterrence in that theater. We might also end up hitting on the Indo-Pacific a little bit at the end because here at CNAS we've worked a lot on that topic, and my colleagues Andrew Metrick, Phil Shears, and I have a new report coming out soon on it. Nice. So we're gonna ping you.
To that.
For the audience, I will take questions. I'll break off at some point and not just hurl every single thing that I want to ask Dr. Narang at him and let you come in. If you're online, you need to identify yourself. You can ask a question two ways. You can either use the chat box at the bottom of the screen, or if you are on Twitter or what we now call X, I guess, use the hashtag CNAS 2024. Please get those in early. I'll try to inject some of the ones, especially online, throughout the course of the conversation if they fit into where we're already going. Okay, you ready?
Yeah, thanks. And first of all, let me just say thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here with old friend Stacie. And thanks to you for coming in the audience and those tuning in online. It's really nice to be able to talk about some of the work we've been doing in the office and the interagency on NATO, nuclear deterrence, and broader security issues. So thanks, Stacie.
Oh, I'm always enjoy talking to you, and I'm really excited for this because I'm sure we will go.
It's okay. My team's really nervous about what I'm about to say. Okay.
All right, let's talk about Europe and what's been happening with Russia. And I think I often get frustrated. We hear a lot of people, we know that nuclear policy evolved during the unipolar era after the Cold War ended, and that the U.S. was looking at reducing its reliance on nuclear weapons, and NATO did as well. Russia didn't follow suit. And obviously, since it invaded Ukraine again in 2022, has been engaged in a lot of saber rattling and threatening to use non-strategic nuclear weapons. And this has sort of awakened Europe to the fact that it has to re-engage with its nuclear policy and think about what needs to be done to bolster deterrence. And I'm of the opinion, and I'm curious what you think, that the threat isn't the same as it was during the Cold War. Exactly. We face a very different situation in many ways. So I want to get your characterization of Russia's nuclear threat right now.
Thanks, Stacie. So I think we'll look back at the post-Cold War era in Europe and NATO as intermission. And we had essentially two halves of the play. First was the Cold War. And the central challenge in the Cold War for NATO was, how do we deter what we believed was a conventionally superior Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact? And we had to think about employing nuclear weapons first to thwart, deter a conventional attack from the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And then how do we manage escalation in that scenario? And so our strategic force, our NATO posture, was built for essentially rapid first employment of nuclear weapons and then managing the potential escalation or deterring escalation, building force that was essentially for escalation dominance during the Cold War. And then after the Cold War, for NATO, a lot of the, we reduced the nuclear, the forward deployed nuclear force posture throughout Europe. And a lot of the institutional memory and the muscle memory for nuclear deterrence sort of languished because Russia was a partner. Until 2014 with the invasion of Crimea, and then obviously again, most visibly February 22 with the invasion of Ukraine. But the challenge now is sort of flipped. NATO is the conventionally superior adversary. And so the muscle memory we had from the Cold War is not as applicable. We still leave open the possibility that we may have to use and employ nuclear weapons first in against strategic attack or nuclear to deter nuclear attack. But now the central challenge is, how do we deter Russian first employment if they believe that they are at risk of losing a conventional war, facing an existential conventional threat, which they have defined a threshold that is quite low. And so we have flipped the central challenge, I think, in the NATO AOR, and we are developing that muscle memory. How do we deter Russian first employment, particularly non-strategic nuclear weapons, or I like to refer to them as, I prefer to refer to them as treaty unaccountable nuclear weapons, because any use of nuclear weapons will fundamentally change the character of conflict and has strategic impact. And so we have, I would say over the last 2 years especially, but even prior to that, I'm very proud of the work we've done with our NATO allies in the bodies such as the High Level Group and the Nuclear Planning Group. And the interagency has really led an effort at a time when there's a lot of coherence and unity in the alliance to rebuild nuclear muscle memory and move out at speed. I mean, I think the amount of progress we've made in 2 years to think about what NATO nuclear posture needs to look like, what are the sort of what I call software upgrades, planning, assessment of the security environment, nuclear command and control, and exercises have improved and made progress at a pace that I think would have been unthinkable for an alliance that's 31 big in the nuclear bodies. But it made a lot of progress, and what I want to close with is it doesn't stop. This is now, I think, a generational challenge with a Russia that has at least revisionist objectives in its near abroad, and the invasion of Ukraine, I think, is not the end, but potentially the beginning of Putin's vision of what Russian appetite might be. And so NATO will have to continually assess the fitness of its nuclear posture. I think we've made it not just fit for purpose, but fitter for purpose, a phrase that I've told is grammatically incorrect, but we made hats, so I think it's real now. And so that's the challenge going forward, to sustain this momentum and continue to assess against an evolving security environment the dynamism of nuclear strategy and posture and deterrence, and continue to make the posture and the deterrent fitter for purpose.
That's good. I mean, it's amazing how much the security situation as a whole and NATO as an alliance has just become energized due to Russia's decision to invade Ukraine and what's happened since then. And I agree with you. You know, Russia's conventional forces have underperformed in many ways, but they pulled themselves together. Yeah. But they are still the inferior sort of force in that theater when compared to the entirety of the alliance, especially on the air side, but that in some ways makes it more dangerous and difficult to manage. So I'm going to turn briefly and try to draw some parallels between potentially we've been seeing in the Pacific, or what we think is happening there, and Europe. So Andrew Fell in my report, Over the Brink, is going to come out in a few weeks, and one of the core ideas is one that Andrew had about the conventional nuclear crossfade. And this is the idea that escalation risks aren't linear. Khan got it wrong. We're not just walking up one ladder. There are multiple intersecting and ladders at different levels that are happening at the same time, and that we've entered a world in which a country could conclude that a nuclear attack is potentially less risky and escalatory than a conventional one. And that you're seeing conventional weapons can be used to have strategic effects. You know, as the United States supposedly considered conventional responses were Russia to have employed a weapon in Ukraine. And we think a lot of this is driven by some specific things to the theater, in particular the geography in the Indo-Pacific, that make it very different from Europe. But I think the broader point that there are really there's growing uncertainty about the interactions between different domains and conventional and nuclear capabilities, and that there is a declining threshold potentially for nuclear use.
Absolutely.
Could actually hold true in Europe as well. Do you think that's so, and what do you think is driving that?
Yeah, I think that's right. The way I frame it is, we have this concept of conventional nuclear integration, and that's often conflated with conventional support for nuclear operations. But I think there is another implication of conventional nuclear integration that we have to think about, which is during the Cold War, I think there was a very small risk of strategic nuclear exchange between the superpowers. And we've traded that now for a higher risk of theater nuclear employment by Russia or China or the DPRK. One little side note, we talk about the two-peer problem. I don't like that phrase. I think it's the multiple nuclear challenger problem, because don't sleep on North Korea, and each of the challengers are different. Russia is a nuclear peer but not a peer in any other domain. China is a peer in many domains but not yet a nuclear peer, but the temporal dimension of its rise as a nuclear peer creates both opportunities but also vulnerabilities and potential risks. And don't sleep on North Korea. So the most likely employment of nuclear weapons, in my view, in this in the contemporary and I think future security environment is arising from an intense and long conventional conflict. And the risk of nuclear employment isn't linear or constant in that conventional conflict. It spikes and ebbs and flows, and you're waging a conventional conflict under the constant threat of potential nuclear employment by your adversary at a very low level. And that is a very different challenge than we've previously faced. And so the conventional nuclear integration piece that I don't want, I think, policymakers and scholars and analysts to sleep on is we have to think about what waging that conventional conflict looks like. It can be high intensity in a long conventional conflict where we have a lot of assets that attrit, but you'll also have higher intensity periods in that conventional conflict which start running up on potential nuclear thresholds. And if, God forbid, a nuclear weapon is employed in theater, you still have to prosecute that conventional conflict. It's not like the conventional conflict stops. Mm-hmm. So you will be trying to restore deterrence or deter further employment while still waging the conventional conflict. And those may reinforce each other, but it may not. You may have to take additional measures or additional posture, signaling and adjustment, and or employment to restore deterrence at the nuclear level while you're still waging this conventional conflict. And so there's a dynamism to the conventional nuclear integration now that I think is sort of a hallmark and characteristic feature of the security environment in both the Indo-Pacific and in Europe.
I agree. And I see Andrew in the audience smiling because he wrote a report on protracted war. And if you get into a long conventional conflict, there are any number of mechanisms that might increase the likelihood of nuclear use, but one of them might be you're just running low on your preferred conventional munitions, yep. And you need to figure out how to continue to fight. And if you have especially small enough of nuclear weapons, just in terms of yield, you can think about
substitution for conventional, right?
Exactly.
And there's in protracted conflicts, there's a risk of sort of intense breakthrough, but also stalemate breaking down, and these periods where the risk of nuclear employment sort of spikes. And I think we've sort of seen that in the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, and I think on the conventional nuclear integration, you're spot on. It's not about conventional forces supporting nuclear forces, though that's needed. It's really understanding the interdependencies of them and sort of sensitizing a greater part of the military, so it's not just STRATCOM or Global Strike that is aware of the escalatory dynamics and what could happen, but the COCOMs, whether it's INDOPACOM or EUCOM, and I know in EUCOM that is more a core part of the mission, but forces tend to think about them as entirely siloed domains.
Right, and in the European context in particular, right, the forward deployed nuclear weapons are under SACEUR's AOR and not Stratcoms, which is unique, and so they have to be integrated. And the other, I think, important point, something we've worked very hard on at NATO to reinforce your point, is in a long, intense conventional conflict, the conventional assets that are going to support those nuclear operations are going to be attrited. So you have to think about building resilience and redundancy in all of the missions that would be necessary for the duration of a long conflict that involve conventional support for nuclear operations. That may be your DCA assets themselves, and don't sleep on tankers. We need the conventional, because those are going to be assigned to the conventional fight. There will be attrition, degradation of that support for the conventional fight. And then if there is a period where the nuclear risk rises or there is nuclear employment, there will be necessary to support both the conventional fight and the nuclear sort of response at the same time. And so we have to build all that resilience and redundancy into the conventional forces to be able to support nuclear operations.
Yeah, absolutely. Tankers are probably one of the most overstretched. You look at homeland security and then for projecting power forward, whether it's conventional or nuclear, and there's a lot that is required of them. So let's go back. You had mentioned before that you have been impressed by the progress that NATO's made in the past couple of years. If you were to give NATO a grade right now, I know you're going to go back and start teaching soon. So if you were to grade it for its current nuclear posture and its efforts to respond to this new threat environment in Russia, what would you give and why?
I mean, so MIT is notorious for not having grade inflation, but I would give NATO an A+. I think the nuclear bodies have really worked, have moved out at speed to rebuild and recover both the institutional memory, but also rebuild the organs and the expertise in nuclear affairs, and this is across the alliance. It has been remarkable. There are 31 allies in the nuclear bodies. France sits outside. But all 31 allies, and we have some of our allies here today, have really put a lot of energy, effort, and resources into the nuclear deterrent mission. And we've had the addition of Finland and Sweden, and both of those allies have been welcome and refreshing voices in the nuclear bodies and very enthusiastic contributors to the broader mission. And we're always looking for ways to broaden participation in a variety of ways. But we've moved out on hardware, so we're in the middle of the F-35 transition. So the Dutch and the United States will be the first nuclear certified have the first nuclear certified F-35s, and the Dutch have really led the way in the alliance. And we're doing the swap from the legacy B-61 3.4s to the modern B-61 12s. And the combination of the 5th gen F-35 with the modernized B-61 TAC-12 with the tail kit is really a big advance for NATO's nuclear posture writ large. And we have 3 nuclear powers in NATO. So the United States, particularly the United States, is the supreme guarantor, but the United Kingdom directly contributes its forces to the defense of NATO. France independently, but not uncoordinated, contributes its forces to the defense of NATO and has a European dimension. And we've been able to work together as the nuclear powers, but also as an alliance to really, I think, assess not only the fitness of the nuclear posture today, but what it takes to be fitter for purpose in the future. But I would say the software upgrades have been equally impressive. We talk about raising and refreshing our nuclear IQ across the alliance because policy directors come in every couple of years. It's a constant effort to educate and raise and refresh our understanding of the threat and what it takes to meet it. And we have made historic strides on planning and on a variety of other, I think, necessary processes to make the deterrent credible, effective, safe, secure, and that has happened, I would argue, in a short period. 2 years in the history of NATO is very short, and to be able to come as far as we have, and I think set us up on a path to continue that into the coming years has been really remarkable.
Okay, so NATO's doing well. You're giving them high marks.
Can always do better. It's not like, but it's not. Don't rest on your laurels.
No,
right?
no.
There's a lot of work to be done. But I think the commitment to doing that is very strong.
Excellent. That is reassuring. I'm going to remind the virtual audience, I see a few questions coming in. Keep putting those in. I'm going to turn to them before too long. So I think I agree, like on the hardware side, right? We've basically modernized the nuclear weapons in Europe, not only the delivery platforms, they're 5th generation jets now, and then actually have precision guided weapons instead of dumb bombs. And that is all fabulous. And I take your point that we're making progress on planning, but I want to push you on this a little bit. Becca and I had argued in a report a couple of years ago, Integrated Deterrence with Allies and Partners, that one of the most important things is this planning piece. And you're not going to necessarily agree to all the specifics ahead of time, but sort of raising the issues, starting to surface what different countries' positions are, so you know where there's overlap, where there are gaps, how you can work around differences is really, really important. And it's so hard on the nuclear issue. And when I've been in conversations, with academics from NATO countries, many are very uncomfortable even talking about it. And I think we have to really be considering, all right, if Russia were to use a low-yield nuclear weapon right now, how are we going to respond? What are we going to do? And we've seen NATO as an alliance has been very, very slow in decision-making in some past crises like Kosovo, I imagine that's getting harder because it's getting bigger, and normally when you have more people, that can be an issue.
You're fighting the collective action problem but I think in the event of Russian non-strategic or treaty unaccountable nuclear weapons employment, you will see a coherence and unity in the alliance. It'll be the first use of nuclear weapons in anger since World War II, and so that is a watershed moment in the history of Europe. And I would imagine that there would be significant unity. And I think that the plans themselves are always evolving, et cetera. I think the most important thing is recovering the expertise for planning. So that a lot of the effort has I think been focused on the planning processes, and also cohering, to your point, focusing on coherence between the conventional plans at NATO and what might be potential nuclear plans, right? So because you're going to be waging this conventional fight, and it'll be in the midst of that intense conventional fight that there may be Russian nuclear employment. So how do you then continue the conventional fight while still trying to restore deterrence in Europe? And so it's a living, breathing thing, even in our own system in the United States, right? As we think about planning and plans, it's the planners and planning process that is the most important. And I think that's what is the primary focus at NATO, both on the conventional and I think as the communique says after the NPG, there was sort of a discussion of the planning process that's been recovered, and that's, I think I'm comfortable saying that's really what the focus is on.
Yeah, no, the process, it's all about the process, but it's also being willing to have really uncomfortable and frank discussions behind closed doors, and so you can have some understanding of where you are, so you can respond more quickly. So I'm going to pull in a question from the audience online, Jeff, and what I was going to ask about. Moscow has, said that it has intentionally adopted an asymmetric strategy, like you wrote about in your first book, with Iskanders and Kinzhals having dual capable systems because of the United States and NATO's conventional superiority. So if we're doubling down on conventional weapons, in some ways we're going to push them to further, we risk pushing them further to rely on nuclear systems. And there is a question, as even our upgraded nuclear capabilities in Europe with F-35 and the new B-61, 12?
Yeah.
12? Do we need something else? Do we need more? Do we need the slick amend? Do we, what other sort of capabilities
we're doing a slick amend, and I see my slick amend buddy in the back. Yeah, we're doing a slick amend. The department is proceeding with a slick amend as sort of prescribed in the NDAA. I think the future NATO capabilities are a discussion for the alliance, and I think the alliance needs to have those hard discussions. I'm very confident in the F-35 transition and B-61 TAC-12. That is a significant upgrade over the 4th gen fighters or 4.5 and B-61 legacy B-61 3-4s. So we're just getting through that transition. The discussion about what may come next is really like the next in the 10, 20-year time frame at this point. The alliance needs to have that discussion. And I think there are different voices about that. There are, I mean, we've talked about now the Silica Men, will come online in the mid-2030s. But when you look at the European geography, Silica Men has some potential regional deterrent capabilities, but it's mostly a land environment, right? So I think for the moment, the suite of capabilities that the U.S., United Kingdom, and France have. France has a standoff air capability, the ASMPA. And the United States and the UK have sea-based capabilities, as well as, I mean, we still have the low-yield W-76 TAC-2, and then the suite of absolutely exquisite conventional capabilities. So our overall deterrent posture, I'm very confident in, but the discussion about what comes after the B-61 TAC-12, I mean, that's a long-term discussion. We're just going through the transition now, and that's a discussion that I think the alliance needs to have. I mean, that's the purpose of bodies like the high-level group and the nuclear planning group are to think about what comes next. And any discussions that may happen in the coming years on future capabilities in NATO aren't going to be delivered for 20, 30 years anyway. So I think it's important, to make the capabilities and the deterrent that we have, we're just going through transition, as fit for purpose as possible.
Makes sense. One of the conventional capabilities that we do have, and that is being discussed and has gotten a lot of attention because of the dissolution of the INF Treaty, are conventional
long-range fires.
Long-range fires in Europe, and I know the Army is planning on at least rotating some of the missiles that are a part of its multi-domain task force. You have the misfortune of having written a lot before you went into government on these issues, so we know that you had previously said that you didn't think that was that important. Have your views changed given like what Russia's done with the Iskanders in Belarus?
Yeah, so I mean,
because the situation has evolved a lot.
The situation
to be fair to you.
I mean, I think in a world in which Russia wasn't deploying and violating openly the INF Treaty and developing a suite of theater dual capable missiles, there's a world in which you say you wouldn't need Glickums or long range fires, but we are responding responsibly to the threat. I mean, I think this is in our Russia. Let's be clear, Russia was violating the INF Treaty and continues to develop capabilities that are inconsistent with the erstwhile INF Treaty. And I think the U.S. has been very restrained and responsible. But if Russia continues down this path, we signaled there will be consequences, and we would respond accordingly to optimize our deterrent posture in Europe. And I think you're starting to see that and what the consequences of Russia's violation of the INF Treaty are. And to be clear, these are conventional. Russia's are dual capable. The long-range fires that rotate through Germany would be conventional only. I mean, we have no intention of deploying nuclear capable or dual capable systems. And so we maintain and continue to be, I think, a responsible actor in this regard, and I think we are responding responsibly as well.
Yeah, and actually open about what we're doing and
Absolutely.
transparent
Very
about
transparent
it.
about it.
So one of the things that is within our control that we could change in terms of making NATO's nuclear posture more fit for purpose is...
See, that's grammatically correct. It's not as catchy as fitter for purpose, though, but yeah.
I will, fitter for purpose is to bring in some of the newer members to the alliance and perhaps involving them in the dual capable aircraft mission or some of the supporting conventional operations. And I know Poland has expressed an interest, and other countries may be interested as well. Poland's getting F-35s, but they're conventional only at this moment in time. I think there's a lot of complexity to this issue, right? I was reading a lot of Cold War history in Europe recently, and having tactical nuclear weapons that far forward is really vulnerable and potentially crisis destabilizing and might not make sense.
Right.
But there are more artful ways that you could work this, where perhaps the Polish F-35s went to other bases that are existing instead of putting them there. Or I've heard ideas that a few pilots contribute to the mission.
Cruise. Yep.
Yeah. What do you think about this? What do you think should be happening in terms of Poland in particular, but also just expanding the nuclear mission to new members?
Yeah, so I want to make that's a really good question. I want to make a distinction between nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons infrastructure, and then participating in the broader nuclear deterrent mission, which takes a variety of forms, including conventional support for nuclear operations, including participating in exercises like Steadfast Noon. Steadfast Noon was classified. We couldn't even say Steadfast Noon until a couple years ago. Now we're open about Steadfast Noon as being a major NATO exercise, and we're seeing more and more contributions from the entire alliance and new members in the broader deterrent mission. And I want to be clear that there's no intention of changing deploying nuclear weapons anywhere where they currently are not. But that doesn't mean that allies cannot and should not participate in other ways that can support the broader mission. So welcome Poland's enthusiasm. Finland and Sweden have been extremely enthusiastic. In fact, I would say all the allies have been enthusiastic about broadening and contributing to the broader mission. And that can include security forces, conventional support. It can include tankers. It can include fighter escorts that are conventional. And I think the alliance needs to have a discussion about sort of the opportunities of two things. One, the common F-35 program, but also the changing geography of the alliance. The addition of Finland and Sweden is a huge strategic change for the alliance. And I want to be very clear that it was not NATO expansion that caused Russian aggression. It was Russian aggression that caused NATO expansion in Finland and Sweden. And so there are opportunities there, and the alliance, again, needs to have those conversations about how allies and the alliance more broadly can make the deterrent sort of fitter for purpose. And we over-index, I think, on sort of nuclear weapons themselves. There is so much that goes into the nuclear deterrent mission that allies can contribute in so many ways that would be beneficial to the alliance, including the conventional support for nuclear operations. And so we welcome that enthusiasm. And then I think it's between SHAPE and the nuclear bodies, like the high-level group and the nuclear planning group, thinking about the optimal ways that a particular ally could contribute that really benefits the mission itself in terms of geography capabilities and also their own financial resources. And so, again, I've been very, very gratified to see the level of enthusiasm across the alliance. The Baltic states, Poland, Finland, Sweden, all across the alliance, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, well, not France in the nuclear bodies, but France in general. I think there's been a lot of forward movement and thinking about how that contribution can improve. And it's up to the alliance, I think, to figure out what the particularities are.
Yeah, it's a really good point, too. The really focus on that not all member states are the same. They have different, strengths, weaknesses, advantages, and really tailoring contributions in a way that improves the whole, but also fits within what characteristics they have.
Yeah.
Is really
essential. And you made a very good point, right? I mean, we also have to think about what vulnerabilities are created, in any posture adjustments. Are they survivable, right? We want to improve the survivability, not the vulnerability of the broader deterrent mission. And so that's where the sort of conversation between the nuclear bodies and SHAPE are really important, right? So what we are thinking about as an alliance, is it actually contributing to the credibility, efficacy, survivability of the deterrent mission more broadly?
Yeah. All right, I want to turn us to one of your other areas that is interrelated, space. We have a question online about Russia developing a nuclear weapon that could be detonated in orbit as a form of anti-satellite attack. And this is a really sort of potentially self-defeating action because Russia also relies on space capabilities.
Yep.
But it's also just a really unusual type of attack, despite, hemp attacks and things like that.
Yep.
And a symmetrical response doesn't seem like it would make any sense.
Right.
So how is NATO thinking about the first mover advantage conferred by such a capability and sort of deterring this action, and then potentially having to respond to it if deterrence fails?
It's a good question. I mean, this is so off the line, but maybe not surprising for Russia, right? I mean, this is so Russian. It's a brute force, asymmetric capability. We are so dependent on space for our way of life, but also in the way we prosecute, wage wars, right? So space is critical to the joint force. And Russia is not as dependent on space for either its way of life or the way it prosecutes wars. And so Russia sees that asymmetry and is like, rather than, sort of direct descent ASATs, which will kill one satellite, I'm just going to put a nuke up there. And it's going to wipe out the entire orbit.
Area effects.
It's such a Soviet mentality that in some ways it is so off the line because of violation of the Outer Space Treaty if it's deployed. It's so irresponsible because it may not directly kill people, but the indirect impact would be tremendous across the entire world. It's indiscriminate. So China, who is a major spacefaring nation, would have as much to lose as the United States would. And so I think the most important thing is convincing Russia not to do this, and to not be so irresponsible as to put a nuclear weapon in space where, I mean, just that theoretically, command and control on terrestrial Earth is hard enough. How are you going to command and control this thing, right? And have confidence that you can command and control. And what happens if you cannot? And so there are all sorts of risks if they deploy this weapon. And I think the most important message now is to not do it, and that there would, it is a threat to all of humanity, including Russia, if this is put up, because of the risk once it's even put up that you lose the ability to command and control it. And so it is both shocking and not shocking at the same time, but it's such a clear violation of international norms and responsible behavior that I think it is now incumbent on sort of anybody who can convince Russia to not do this. That's our sort of best path forward, in my view.
Absolutely. I'm struck by how right you are in terms of it being a very Russian response. Former RAND colleagues always would say, why would I want to precisely hit a point in the grid scale if I can just barrage effects across the whole thing? But Russia does have more conventional anti-counterspace capabilities too, or more discriminating, right? They've tested a direct descent ASAT, which would only take out one bird, not an entire orbit. There's also been reports of them following too closely and having potentially on-orbit sort of types of attacks. And as you noted, our joint force is heavily dependent on space, not only for our conventional operations, but also for nuclear command and control and communications. So how are you thinking about this? This is one of those areas of the crossfade that I think Andrew's talking about, which is potentially really, really concerning because it could blind U.S. early warning satellites. It could take out, communications that are essential to actually our second strike capability.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think the interagency is taking this extremely seriously. And I think there's a lot of work and messaging being done. I think we've talked about going to China and to India and to those who can convince Russia. Again, the best path forward is to convince Russia not to put this up because, as you noted, the consequences would be indiscriminate and widespread, have impact. Now, I mean, I think there are assessments, obviously, about what the impact would be. It varies, but there are a lot of variables involved, depending on what it is and if it is employed, in what mode. But I think in every scenario, it's essentially catastrophic for the entire world, and I think that's the message that we want to keep conveying to the international community in Russia to try and convince Putin not to put this up.
All right, I'm going to bring in the audience for real in 1 second. This is going to be my, I've skipped a lot, so I might go back to other things. But all right, let's talk about China. And I actually really appreciate you bringing up the DPRK too. That's what, in a report a while ago with Long Shadows, I included them because you can't sleep on that. The peninsula is potentially very concerning in terms of the escalation risk there. So we're facing this new nuclear multipolar world in some ways, and having to deter simultaneously in multiple theaters, multiple great powers, plus other revisionist states.
Yep.
And at the same time, we're now, we've finally, after deferring it for so long, are modernizing the triad of the U.S.'s nuclear deterrent. I'm tying in a question from Shelley online, who was asking about sort of the cost overruns on Sentinel, which are pretty large, and whether we need to continue with the program given this environment. And I want to also say that, well, I know Sentinel had this Nunn-McCurdy breach that is probably giving Andrew Hunter an ulcer, but it isn't. I don't think people appreciate the scale of the modernization that's happening in the civil infrastructure and sort of construction that has to go along with it. It's not just the missile. We haven't built silos really and upgraded most of them since the first Minutemen.
100%.
And that all of this is now like a 60-plus-year-old bill that's coming due, essentially.
Yep.
So do you think it's essential that we go forward with Sentinel and modernizing the triad?
100,000%. We cannot afford not to proceed with Sentinel. I've learned a lot about Nunn-McCurdy and budget processes, and I think this is important. It's not an actual cost overrun yet. It was a cost projection overrun. The cost projections are wrong because, and I don't want to speak for my ANS colleagues, but the way I have understood it is that the cost projections, were sort of, because we haven't built the launch facilities and the silos, the whole complex, in so long. The estimates and the assumptions behind them were incorrect, and I think there's going to be it's diagnosis of root cause analysis and an assessment of sort of how to prevent this from happening again. But I want to emphasize that one, the modernization program was sized in the early 2010s for essentially a New Start Russia. When Russia was a partner, when we thought the New Start, at least formally, if not informally, would persist indefinitely, and when China had not embarked on its sprint, and when North Korea had not, sort of diversified and expanded its nuclear arsenal. So number one, as the Secretary has said, as we've said publicly, the modernization program is not only necessary, and absolutely necessary, it may not be sufficient, right? We have to think about now this new environment. Do we have to make any augmentations and or adjustments to the nuclear program of record for the multiple peer world, largely driven by the growth in Chinese forces? But at the very least, we have to continue with the modernization program. And I will say this about I can extol the virtues of each leg of the triad. I love them, all of my children equally. But the IC leg, and I think this is really important, right? The IC leg the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The ICBM leg enhances the efficacy and the survivability of your bombers and your SLBM leg. And they each have different attributes and hold other, different targets at risk differentially, where we cannot afford not to have an ICBM leg. And a modernized Sentinel, we're going to have to sustain Minuteman III a little longer than planned, but the transition to Sentinel is absolutely critical in the backstop of U.S. national security. And so you'll hear these proposals, I'll just take the money and put it towards the SLBM leg or the B-21s. You will erode the efficacy of your SSBM leg and your bomber leg without an ICBM leg. And we can get into the deterrence benefits of sort of the way we have thought about the ICBM leg. The virtue of the ICBM leg, the way the U.S. has developed, is prompt. It is the most prompt leg of the triad, and that can't be replicated with the other legs of the triad. And it complicates adversary decision making, and that is something that the other legs of the triad, if we did not have the IC leg, could not compensate for very easily. And so it is not just that the IC leg has its own attributes, but the totality of the triad is irreplaceable. And so I think the finding was that the continuing with the Sentinel program was absolutely crucial to national security. And there were cost overruns, and there will be diagnosis about it, projected cost overruns. But we have to commit to the Sentinel program that we have, and I think there's really no substitute for it.
I completely agree. I think it's a really important point that it's all three of the delivery systems for the strategic weapons have strengths and weaknesses, but it is them working together that provides us with a really robust deterrent capability. And I think we're just beginning to understand what is going to be needed in this emerging world with multiple nuclear peers and the DPRK, maybe Iran in the future. And I know you edited a excellent book with Scott Sagan on that came out recently, and it seems imprudent to sort of try to scale things back at this moment when there's so much influx.
Yeah, and involved with the non-McCurdy process in the department. It was led by ANS. It was rigorous. Alternatives were explored, right? If you the alternatives that are out in that scholars, analysts talk about, like mobile ICBMs. One, super expensive, and two, not as prompt. So if the virtue of the IC leg, the way we conceive it, is the promptness, that would be eroded with mobile ICBMs. And by the way, who wants these driving around in their backyards? That's a political problem. The second, I see this also too, which is just put Trident 2s in silos. Don't build a new Sentinel. From a policy standpoint, my concern with an alternative like that is, well, now you have single point failure across your strategic legs if there were an emergent issue with the Trident, right? So diversity.
Plus, you have to modernize the support infrastructure, and it's
still
not going to be ready to support.
You still have to do that. And
love Jeffrey Lewis, but he's wrong.
Yeah, no, so a lot of the alternatives may sound good in theory, but the practicalities of it, and also the impact on, sort of managing the program over 40, 50 years, introduces policy risk that I don't think we can afford. And so that was sort of, from a policy standpoint, we were 100,000% supportive of continuing with the Sentinel program.
Excellent. So everybody in the in-person audience has been very patient as I've interspersed questions online and entertained all of my own queries. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone. Andrew?
Take it easy, Raiden.
Thanks much. I'm Andrew Aiden. I work at RAND. I'm a senior political scientist there. You mentioned lessons from Ukraine for nuclear thresholds. I want to follow up on that. Two issues that I think we've seen. One is the risk of Russian saber rattling, sort of deterring U.S. policy. How do we ensure that the United States is not being self-deterred because of Russia making noise about nuclear weapons? The second is...
Can I take them in turn so I don't forget?
Sure.
So on that, I would disagree with the premise of the question. I don't think we've been deterred by Russian saber rattling. I think deterrence has largely held in the Ukraine conflict. We have deterred Russia also from hitting NATO territory. There are a lot of targets that would have actually probably helped Russia's conventional fight in Ukraine that were in NATO territory, and they did not hit them. And so deterrence, one of the virtues, I don't want to get on a tangent, but like one of the things that we did see in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is that our 75 years of nuclear communication with Russia, actually, we know each other's baselines. I think they know what is routine activity for us. A Minuteman III test out of Vandenberg, they know it's routine. BTFs, they know they're routine. We see what they do. We know it's routine. So we know what a signal looks like. I will say in the Indo-Pacific, this is my bigger concern. We don't know. We're still working out that communication with China. China doesn't want to talk to us, right? So we don't know what China's baseline is, and it's unclear whether they know what our baseline is. And so what has, I think, enabled deterrence to really hold in Ukraine partly, one is, I think, the virtues of nuclear weapons imposing at least some guardrails in the conflict. Russia has not hit NATO territory, and I think Russia has largely deterred NATO attacks on. Russia has deterred NATO attacks on Russian territory. So that is what nuclear weapons are, I think, designed to do: establish guardrails. And I think that history of communication helped establish those guardrails. In the Indo-Pacific, I think one of the things that China has been unwilling to do is have that communication. I mean, the outreach for China on strategic stability talks has been rebuffed, and we don't have that same history of communication with the PR.
And I totally agree. We've written about communication on space as well as another concern. Second is, let's suppose there's a Russian first use in Ukraine. I appreciate the allies are talking about this as a time of unity. Do you think there would be a risk of allies and partners making different decisions, challenging the non-proliferation regime?
Well, can you elaborate on the last point?
So,
do you mean will they pursue their own nuclear
yes.
weapon? I would hope not. I think one, U.S. extended deterrence guarantees, particularly in NATO, are robust, credible, and I think assure allies that the United States, France, and the United Kingdom will sort of extend their nuclear deterrent in the defense of NATO. The president has said that the use of nuclear weapons by Russia on any scale anywhere would be met with severe consequences. Now that is intentionally sort of it includes, depending on employment, a variety of responses from the alliance, but also from the United States, the United Kingdom, or potentially France themselves in some coordinated fashion. But I think that those extended deterrence guarantees from the three nuclear powers in NATO should, I believe, be sufficient to convince allies that pursuing their own nuclear weapons is not in their own interest, right? Because they'd be very vulnerable while they pursue nuclear weapons. And this is true of any of our allies that I think pursue nuclear weapons across the world, that there's, you can't just acquire nuclear weapons overnight, right? It takes time, and the adversary against whom you're developing them against will probably know you're pursuing them, and you'd be very vulnerable. So we continue to believe that extended deterrence is in the interest not of the United States, but also its allies, and that our allies adhering to the non-proliferation obligation is also in their interest.
Other questions?
Thank you. Matt Koslow with National Institute. We've mentioned the multiple nuclear peer problem a couple times. Do you believe that states in NATO understand where the United States is coming from with opportunistic aggression and the threat of that? And do you think that's going to be built into potential future NATO nuclear posture changes that may need to happen? Do they realize the stretch that our capabilities can't cover as they're currently postured? And does that affect how NATO thinks about its nuclear posture going forward?
That's a good question. I think, so on opportunistic aggression, that is precisely the conversation I think we're having both with our Indo-Pacific partners and our NATO allies. I would argue that our nuclear forces are flexible enough and postured in a way that it's not, I'm not so worried about being pulled one way or the other. The regional deterrence capabilities in NATO are independent of any regional deterrence capabilities, and the triad, which is flexible enough for deterring the multiple challengers. But I think that there's the conversation is in the event of we're temporarily pulled to the Indo-Pacific, for example. How do we, as an alliance, convince Russia or deter Russia from opportunistic aggression as a whole? U.S. forces are still going to be in Europe. Our forward deployed nuclear weapons are still going to be there. It's not like those are going to be, those don't swing out. But what can our allies do, right? And this is where it's the burden sharing and contributions of the allies are so important. What can the allies do, and what will, from a nuclear, for the nuclear powers, these are conversations we have. The United Kingdom and France, in that period, may end up having a greater role in deterring opportunistic aggression, while the United States is still present, but in an Indo-Pacific crisis or conflict. But I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I am not concerned that being pulled into a crisis in either NATO, crisis or conflict in either Europe or the Indo-Pacific would so erode our conventional or nuclear deterrent posture in a way that would incentivize opportunistic aggression. But we want to work with our allies and partners to ensure that there are contributions to make it as robust and signal the robustness if that were to happen.
Yeah, we've talked about in the forthcoming report that in the Pacific we might be wanting to think about whether we need regional options, not necessarily like NATO because it's not NATO at all, but given the limitations of your ability to signal with undersea nuclear capabilities, whether it's Likamen or the low-yield Trident.
That's why we have the bombers. The visibility of the bomber leg is one of its, and the flexibility are the greatest attributes. And so that's why when we go back to the complementarity of the triad, that's an example where having the bomber leg is so valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for one final question. Is there another one?
Hi, thank you. I'm Liz Muir from the Estonian Embassy, and you were right in saying that the Baltics are enthusiastic
Great partner.
about nuclear. What I wanted to ask is that even though it was mentioned that NATO is conventionally superior to Russia, with the new NATO defense plans, we actually see very clearly certain areas where we have significant shortfalls, such as air missile defense, long-range fires, critical munitions, and the overall ability to really wage a protracted conflict would be a challenge for us. But in terms of conventional support to nuclear operations in a potential conflict, where would you say today are the biggest vulnerabilities when we look at NATO's forces, C2, etc.? Thank you.
Good question, ma'am. And thank you to Estonia for all of its enthusiasm in our bodies. I think two things. One, on your point about sort of the conventional capabilities, I think the Ukraine conflict has reinforced why all NATO allies need to fire up their defense industrial base. And why we focus on high-end capabilities, which are great and exquisite, but to use my favorite phrase, don't sleep on some of the basic stuff, right? 155, for example. And in conventional support for nuclear operations, I think the thing that we've tried to reinforce, and I think is true, is how do we build resilience in the conventional. I mean, these are related. How do you build resilience in the conventional posture and capabilities such that as those are degraded or attrited in if it's a long, intense conventional conflict, how do you ensure that you have enough resilience, quantity, and redundancy in the alliance so that you have enough conventional capabilities for conventional support for nuclear operations deep into a conflict? And that's something, I think everybody understands that. And it's all related, I think, to firing up the DIB. And I think that's something that, as an alliance, I know ASG Angus Lapsley is laser focused on this and this message, and I think that is really, really important.
Okay, on that note, I think we are running up to the end of the hour that we had, so I'd like to thank all of you online and in person for joining us, and Vipin for coming.
Thank you,
I've really
Stacie. Thank you,
enjoyed
everybody.
the conversation.
Thank you. Appreciate it.